James Maybrick began complaining about consistent pains in his stomach. An early examination resulted in the doctor diagnosing no more than dyspepsia. It was highly unlikely, except for understairs gossip, that Florence would ever be accused of poisoning her husband. The children's nurse, Alison Yap, was the one who fueled the fire of discontent concerning Mrs. Maybrick's conduct. Alison had a deep distrust of Mrs. Maybrick ever since she had discovered flypapers containing small amounts of arsenic soaking in Florence's bedroom. Florence later explained she used the arsenic for a skin problem that she often suffered with. This was more than likely true. Like James, most affluent men and women of the time were vain, and many took arsenic to give themselves the then fashionable pale complexion. But Alison Yap, from that moment on, watched Mrs. Maybrick more closely. She even kept James Maybrick's brother Michael informed of all events. Until finally, James Maybrick died. And it was his brother Michael's constant objections which stopped the doctor, who found nothing suspicious about Mr. Maybrick's death, from signing the death certificate. 3 days later, Florence Maybrick was arrested. First, she was taken to the small police station in Lark Lane, then on to Walton Jail.
Oh, naughty Mrs. Maybrick, what have you gone and done? Your goings-on are bad, I must confess. To get mashed on Mr. Brearley was very wrong and teely, so you've got yourself in such a bloomin' mess. Mr. Maybrick has been poisoned and the charming Mrs. M is a well-attended guest at Walton Jail.
This charming little ditty was published as Florence sat in Walton Jail waiting for trial. And so it was, here where it began and ended, on July the 31st, 1889. When asked by Judge Stevens to give an account of herself, she stated plainly and simply,
I am guilty of the intimacy with Mr. Brierley. I am not guilty of this crime.
The whole proceedings would never have come to trial if not for the insistence of James's brother Michael Maybrick, who had received a letter written by Florence for Alfred Brierley and intercepted by the nurse Alison Yap. Florence had made the mistake of writing to Brierley, who at the time was terrified of Maybrick discovering their affair, and then giving it to Alison to post. Alison read the letter, saying she had dropped it in mud by accident, and while replacing the envelope, had looked at it.
My dearest, he is sick unto death. The doctors held a consultation yesterday, and now all depends upon how long his strength will hold out. We are terribly anxious. I cannot answer your letter fully today, my darling, but relieve your mind of all fear of discovery now, all for the future.
Florence had naturally helped to care for her husband. An opportunity to poison him was obviously there. An important part of the prosecution's case was that, on one occasion, meat extract had been prepared in a jug. It was later removed by Florence and then returned. When inspected, it was found to contain grains of arsenic.
The outcome was inevitable, and Florence Maybrick was convicted of the murder of her husband and sentenced to death by hanging. Fortunately for her, the judge was severely criticized. He was booed and jeered as he left the court. During the trial, he continued to show confusion over vital dates, and doubts were cast as to his mental stability. This was to be Judge Stevens' final trial. Shortly afterwards, he was committed to an asylum for the insane. And Florence Maybrick? A petition was sent to the Home Secretary, and as the gallows were being built outside her cell, she was reprieved. The public had its way. The death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment.
She served 15 years and was released in 1904. She then returned to Connecticut and lived in squalor in a bare shack until her death in 1941, aged 79.
Florence Maybrick's adultery was offered as the main motive for murder. Victorian sensibilities deemed adultery far worse than any other crime. The actual cause of James Maybrick's death was almost of secondary importance. And yet the coroner, immediately after the inquest into James Maybrick's death, asserted that there was no discernible trace of arsenic in his body. It's cold in here. A sad place for a sad tale. And yet, even after all these years, it's not over with yet. But that's another story.
The River Mersey, for centuries a barrier to the free passage of goods and materials.
This is the Runcorn Bridge, which today speeds traffic over the River Mersey. Before it was built in the last century, the transporter was used. A perilous journey as you were suspended in a sort of cable car-like contraption dangling over the treacherous waters of the Mersey. The transporter was also used as a means of crossing the Manchester Ship Canal, which runs in parallel with the river here and gives direct access to the inland port of Manchester. Our next tale concerns rites of passage and the tragedy which grew out of a single incident, which still has repercussions even today. We begin by travelling upriver to the town of Warrington, and a time many hundreds of years ago. Warrington Bridge, the place where the Duke of Hamilton surrendered to Cromwell in 1648 after his battle at Red Bank. Here, the Mersey is a much younger river and best spanned by the arch of a stone bridge. But this wasn't always the case. Until the 14th century, the only way to cross this river was by ferry. And whoever owned the ferry rights made a handsome living. So that when a bridge was finally built, conflict was inevitable. Add to that the wounded pride of a medieval king, and you've got all the ingredients of a tale of revenge, tragedy, and bloodshed, which took place within the walls of Bewsey Hall.
In 1429, King Henry VI, who was only 10 years old, was travelling north towards Lancaster and wished to cross the Mersey close to Warrington. His party reached the bridge, the rights of which were owned by Sir John Boteler. The king was, of course, allowed to use the crossing without charge, but Sir John unwisely tried to charge the remainder of the king's party of followers rites of passage.
The king, however, felt deeply insulted and his honour tarnished by Sir John Boteler. He vowed to redress the wrong and demanded the services of Lord Stanley, who just happened to own the rights to the river crossing here at Fiddler's Ferry, which had lost most of its trade to the bridge upstream.
The Earl of Derby gave Lord Stanley, his son, a simple order: to end the line of Sir John Boteler. And so the plot of terrible murder was conceived.
Sir John resided at Bewsey Hall, a fortified manor house with surrounding moat and many defences. Along with his young and beautiful wife Isabella and his infant son and numerous servants, they lived a comfortable life. However, the peace of those times was soon to give way to chaos and murder. On a dark and moonless night, Christmas Eve 1430, Lord Stanley and the assassin William Savage, his accomplice, silently crossed the still moat and entered Bewsey Hall. Helped by a treacherous servant, doors normally closed to raiders were left open. Death entered Bewsey Hall. Using information from the bribed servant, the assassins soon stumbled upon a sleeping Sir John, caught surprised and unable to defend himself. He was hacked limb from limb. The noise of murder and terrible suffering soon awoke the whole household.
The night's evil deeds, however, were far from over. The order had been given to end the family line, and this would have been accomplished had it not been for the heroic efforts of the family's black servant, one Thomas Holcroft, who, according to contemporary accounts, was a colossus of a man, who alone stood in this very doorway, fighting off the three assassins, until he himself fell victim to their swords and died on this very spot. On that night, the beautiful and vulnerable Isabella was alone in this room. Sensing imminent danger, the nanny had spirited away her young son to the protection of a religious order in Warrington. The terrifying cries of her husband brought Isabella into this room, and her servant Thomas to that doorway. Such was the ordeal that Isabella was forced to witness and endure that evening at the hands of the assassins. She barely survived. She was later found by the Franciscans and nursed back to health, and later reunited with her young son. For the next 5 years, and Isabella was even now only aged 24, she did not utter a single word. But eventually the trauma wore off, and she even remarried another local nobleman, Lord Grey, who was considerably older than she was. Even so, she could not forget the past. Who could? And she asked her new husband to use his considerable influence at court to exact some sort of revenge for the death of her former husband. Lord Grey, sensing the wrath of the king, disowned her and dissolved the marriage. Isabella had been married for only 6 hours. Isabella died on the 22nd of May, 1441, aged 30. Her soul tormented by the fact that she could do nothing to avenge her husband's death. And so the story ends. Or does it? The walls of Bewsey Hall still remain, and there are those who believe that Isabella will never give up her fight for justice.
Well, yeah, there's been several strange occurrences here. My experience is probably limited to 1 or 2 times when I've seen things. I can't really tell you what they are. The first time it happened to me was about 2 o'clock in the morning. The alarms had gone off in the building. I put a tracksuit on, come out into the building. There was no lights on then. We've since had it rewired, but there was no lights at all. So I walked up, no break-in anywhere, and this particular room that we'd gone into on the first floor, what we call zone